Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra,
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting, untold stories of people.
associated with the creation
Or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked.
and sometimes what didn't,
You will also hear very personal experiences.
and insights that would trigger your thoughts.
And inspire you to do even greater things.
A career across startups and large companies, engineering and cloud ops, the multi-sided coin of development, QA, monitoring and DevOps, and going beyond algorithmic correctness, thinking, scale and deployment, tied in with developing empathy for what happens post-code development. Listen to the conversation between Rajiv Puranik, VP of Platform Engineering and Cloud Operations at Vocera Communications, in conversation with Sivaguru from PM Power Consulting. Rajiv shares his stories on creating a culture of trust and openness and his experience going through a school of hard knocks. He shares his views on assessing business value to determine criticality and decision-making amidst ambiguity and constantly moving points, and using intuition alongside evaluating as many input parameters and outcomes as possible. And finally, how working with smart, motivated people inspires him along with learning something new constantly and leveraging his past experience, and then his advice for people who are at a fork in the road. Listen on.
Welcome, Rajiv, to the Software People Stories podcast. I'm really very excited to talk to you after we had an initial conversation and got to understand your career trajectory, where you've done a lot of things, very interesting things, very different things. And I'm sure your story would be inspiring to our listeners. As we normally do, we can start with you doing the introduction, because that is probably the best, rather than me trying to say what all you've done.
Okay, happy to do that. First of all, Sivaguru, thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed our earlier conversation and excited to be here for to talk to you and to your listeners. So, by way of introduction, my name is Rajiv Puranik. I'm based in US in California. Have been here for almost entire my career, and currently I am the vice president of platform engineering and cloud operations. So I have a sort of a dual thing, both engineering development as well as deploying it to scale in cloud. And, in past for about 10 years or so, I've been primarily in the cloud doing engineering at, companies like Twillio, Apigee, and before that I was at Yahoo. And so along the way, I viewed myself between corporate, large company jobs, engineering leadership, as well as doing startups. So it's kind of been back and forth, a healthy mix of both, I would say.
Yeah, that's good, because already I have a few questions for you.
Go for it.
So, since you're doing both engineering as well as cloud ops, in the last few years, there has been a lot of discussion on DevOps. Particularly, I'm not so much talking about the technology part, but also getting the developers to understand or empathize with what happens in operations, in production, or the experience of the users. Since you've seen both sides, what do you think is a good or a more effective role that devs can play in building the right products?
Devs and DevOps are kind of two sides of, in fact, it's a multi-sided coin, because the development, QA, and operations, they are all very much interrelated. Okay. And at some level, even product is very much in the mix, because you have to start with understanding of what the right product is, right? Without that, whatever you develop will fall flat. And then specifically to your question, what role does dev play? I think dev needs to understand it's not just about getting the algorithms or the logic of the program right, but to build it to a level it can scale. So here is what a typical ops part of it would be, especially in the cloud, right? One is the security, right? Does it not only do the right function, but does it present itself to being attacked by malicious or whatever, actors? The second aspect of it is clearly scalability, especially as you go into SaaS deployments, you are expected to effectively infinitely scale. So the more aware developers are of these, and not just of the program logic and how to compute something, but of deploying this to scale and learning from each other. Frankly, DevOps is a combination in my opinion, of operations, development, and a very strong sense of QA monitoring. That, by the way, I missed out on that aspect as well. A lot of it has to be done in a way that you are constantly monitoring not only the health of the deployed software, but also what that software is really doing. Meaning, what are the metrics? Which features are being used more often than others? Because that's where the product management comes in. Are you sinking resources and useless features, or are you really concentrating on what really is resonating with your users? Those are the kind of things. So it's really, I consider them to be sides of a multi-sided coin, effectively, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Curiosity question. Do you have any personal horror stories of DevOps? For instance, the very first episode of this podcast, I was talking about my own experience of writing my first program, where everything worked on my terminal. Those days was terminals and connected to mainframes and all that. Then I submitted it as a batch, got into an infinite loop. So my learning that you need to know what will happen there. So do you have any such stories?
And I will intentionally keep names out of it. But yes, I do. In one place, I was greeted one day to an email effectively saying, hey, I have basically shut down I'm controlling your website. I have complete access to your keys. And unless you pay me a ransom, I'm going to basically effectively ruin you. I've gone through that experience and having to recover from that.
Wow. So how do you develop this empathy or understanding of what happens after one writes code?
How do the best part is, I always, for SaaS, I maintain that DevOps is the first line of defense and the second line of defense is engineers. So if they know they have a skin in the game, and if at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. in the morning, and for some strange reason, all the failures happen at 1 or 2 a.m. So I don't know why. It doesn't happen at 2 p.m. when you're wide awake, right? It's always early in the morning. But that joke aside, if you are in the line of fire, right? So you're not tossing stuff over the wall and forgetting it. I think it puts a lot more onus and a lot more sense of ownership. So in terms of having that empathy comes from effectively a shared experience of being in the same boat as the other person. And when you realize what they have to deal with, and ultimately when they cannot deal with it, you have to deal with, works out pretty well.
You also mentioned that you worked in large companies, small companies, product platform environments. Mm-hmm. Does this change based on the size or the type of problems that you're addressing?
To some extent, yes. It really depends more on what kind of philosophy, large or small company you're following. In other words, if you're agile and you're trying to fail forward fast, even in a large company, in many ways it is like a small company setting. But what does happen in a small company or a startup in particular is there is no safety net. You kind of know that what you're building, if that doesn't work out or if it doesn't succeed, your options, your runway is very limited. Whereas there does tend to be a little bit of sense of personal security that even if this product doesn't work, I'll still have a job and I'll still be able to go do a next project. It's a little bit more of a roller coaster in a true startup. But fundamentally, the pace at which you work and the intensity with which you work is pretty much determined by the culture of the large or the small organization. Is it a fail forward fast culture where you try something real quickly in an agile way? Or is it like this deliberate, we are going to spec everything to the last detail and then implement it because we know exactly what the product needs to do?
Yeah, in the IT industry, we come across a lot of people who are good technically, and then as they grow, they end up with a team that they need to manage, where they still feel extremely responsible to the outcomes and whatever needs to be done. With the result, they tend to get into a lot of details and probably in more of a command and control style rather than a mentorship style. So in the case of fail forward, fail fast and all that, what are some tips that you would have for, let's say, the first time leaders to enable that culture or create that culture of trust or openness?
Okay. So I would submit to you that my response is going to be completely independent of whether you're moving agile or fail forward fast or otherwise, because frankly, I won't change that answer in any set. And the key thing is you have to ask yourself, am I going to scale? Okay. And by the way, all of this comes from School of Hard Knocks, which is having made mistakes. And if I go back to my very early days of being a leader, people I worked with probably will certainly say, this guy, this is not the guy I worked with. So I made my share of those mistakes.
Okay.
So you have, a little bit of it is the learning curve of being there. But the most important learning that I carry is, it is true that ultimately it is my responsibility. But then when it comes to whether it means I control and manage it tightly and therefore ultimately fail because I cannot scale, or do I let my teams learn, make mistakes, but in the process I build a culture and a depth in my team where I know, look, the way I look at it is this: even if I'm a super programmer or super developer or whatever, right, I'm going to make mistakes, okay? And my team, even if assuming, and it's a big if, right, they're not as expert at it as I am, they're going to make different mistakes. So it's just a question of what is the difference in mistakes we make and the frequency with it. So in order for me to scale as a leader, I'm better off helping team realize their potential and grow. Otherwise, I'm going to keep them in the box. I'm going to remain in the box. And ultimately, I'm not going to scale. So it's a question of taking, either way you go, you're taking a risk, right? So you have to get comfortable with the fact that trusting your team to do the right thing. That's a better risk than not taking the risk of controlling it and doing it yourself and not scaling. Because good people will not stay with you if you don't let them grow. So you'll be constantly hiring new people and training them if you want to be a control freak.
So how does this
there are
play
probably, by the way, just a little note on that. There probably are some exceptions who are so visionary that, there are examples of various leaders in our industry who are known to be control freaks, but yet people love working for them because of the success they bring, or just the vision they carry with them. So while they're micromanagers, they're also big visionaries. But if you really look at an average of leadership spectrum, those are more exceptions than the rule. Most micromanagers will actually fail eventually. Anyway, you are up to something else.
I just taking this forward of this culture of trust probably becoming even more important now with the current scenario where everybody is kind of forced to work from home and you don't have over the shoulder kind of oversight and still be able to work. Earlier, it used to be when teams were spread across time zones, other than culture, time zone logistics and all that made it difficult for them to all be in sync throughout. But now it's probably taken to the extreme. So what would be some things that at least these first-time leaders need to change in terms of their styles of working, and even team members? What should be different in the way, let's say, I work as a team member when I had either my daily sync ups and so on in person, to this working from home where probably there are a lot of other distractions and concerns which also are interfering?
Understand. So the first and foremost is, don't focus on activity, focus on the results. Right. So is this person or is this group of people producing results? And set we call them OKRs, objectives and key results. Set them up front, saying these are my expectations. This is how I'm going to measure, you individually or as a team. And here is the goal. And if you start at that point, effectively monitoring that for that versus, did you come to work at 9 a.m. today or 10:30 a.m.? Doesn't really matter, especially in the setting that you just mentioned, right? So the first and foremost is focus on the outcomes, not on the methods or whatever. And I'm not saying methods are completely to be ignored, man. There are certain behaviors, responsiveness, some punctuality, being on time for staff meetings, etc. Those are still valuable, but by and large, focus on the outcomes is probably the most important thing here, right? Okay, I lost a little bit. What was the original question again? Because there was another point I was going to make.
No, this was essentially about the command and control micromanaging style versus trusting the team, and the dimension that this forced distributed working adds to that.
Correct. By the way, I was going to make another very important point. So I'm not recommending leaders start with automatic delegation or trust. Trust is something, in my opinion, earned, right? So you do have to establish that, and you have to tune it a little bit, or you have to moderate it a little bit in terms of, if you got someone who is absolutely new to a job or just got promoted, is still learning ropes, you have to direct initially, because they're not necessarily very good at their craft. But your goal, even when you're doing the direction, has to be, how do I get this person to be more and more independent as time passes by? And in fact, that should be built into this OKRs or objective and key results. Hey, today I'm sitting down with you and doing a review of this code line by line. Next time I want to change it, in 6 months. I want you to be able to get it peer reviewed without much help from me, or whatever the situation might demand. And so you move this person or this, and by extension, the group, along the ride of, first starting with being directive as necessary, to becoming more and more independent, where now you're delegating and empowering them rather than telling them exactly how it should be done.
That's nice. A related point there is the obsession, or rightfully, on the product quality. But many times that also gets extended to sticking behind or hiding behind a process, or saying that unless I have this level of quality, I will not let it pass, or I will not put it out in production, versus products that are perennially in beta, perennially experimenting, trying to improve. What would you think is a better approach?
It again, like most things in life, it depends. It depends on what you're trying to do. Okay, if you are developing a spacecraft, or you're doing a radiation equipment software for radiation, you better have an extremely high bar for quality. Right? Not to hide behind the process or anything, but just because you care about the outcome. Ultimately, I believe that quality is a business metric. It is not an engineering or pure technical metric, because quality should be, in other words, what I'm saying is quality should be tuned to the needs of the organization and the product, not to some sort of an abstract or absolute standard. Right? On the other hand, if you are doing something which is less critical, and I'm struggling to think of something which would be trivial, right? But maybe you can help me come up with something where quality is not that important, and if you have to refresh the page because once in a while it goes, like gives you a 404 or whatever, right? It's okay. Nobody is going to die because of. So again, things like healthcare, space exploration, those kind of things demand a much higher degree of business-oriented quality metric than where you are just doing it something for fun and you're kind of building up trivial apps or whatever, right? A finance would be another big quality kind of a thing, because you don't want to mess up somebody's deposit, right? So you have to be extremely quality conscious with that software as well. So it's really, quality is a business metric, in short.
When it comes to that, many teams struggle with this, and product managers also struggle to assign a business value when they want to launch something, or when they want to even add a new feature or change a feature. Have you seen any approaches where, whether it is the OKR model or any other approaches, which help at least in simplifying the outcome, or trying to quantify the output, like you said, and focusing on that, and then tune the activities towards that, whether it is elaboration of the feature, or it's about the prioritization and how you break it up, how you take it up in your execution?
Right. So on the operational side, we do have such metrics. I'm talking about typically the service level agreement, SLAs, where a particular service I'm offering, is it like a mission critical? Are we talking 5 nines, 3, 4 nines, 3 nines? And based on that, the engineering you have to put in and the fail-safe mechanisms you have to put in. And I'm speaking mostly about here operation DevOps kind of things, and not so much functional correctness, right? So functional correctness gets a little trickier, because within that, let's say we are talking about giving someone a count of how many goods are left in the store, right? Like, I'm about to go to a store or I'm about to order, and I want to know how many widgets are left or how many seats are on a given flight. Is this considered, this information, absolutely critically important to be absolutely accurate? Or if it is a little bit older and it's, because your computation you're doing is, the whole Brewer's theorem, you can't have everything, all 3 elements of it in absolute sync. Those becomes now feature related questions. Does that, so for example, imagine you are trying to decide the medicines you have left in your cabinet. That is obviously a much more critical thing than the number of probably seats left on a flight, because you might go to book one and you might have the software come back and say, sorry, I thought I had one, but I don't have it. But it's not as mission critical as knowing how many health equipments you have in store, because the patient might suffer because of that. So those are things that really now become, it kind of, again, the answer is it depends. There is no absolute answer. So typically what happens is, in this case, hopefully you have someone on the team, typically a product manager or someone who leads, possibly even on the engineering side, the engineering leader, who has enough sense for what is going on in business to assign that level of importance or that criticality for correctness to each and every feature within the given product.
Yeah. This question is actually triggered more from something that you had mentioned earlier about how you learn to become an agile decision maker by working in different companies, different organizations, and so on. So the question was more on making decisions when there is ambiguity?
Yes. So, okay, frankly, I have never known a situation where a leader can afford to take decisions with all the data points, because marketplace is this moving target, right? I mean, how many customers are you going to talk to? And how exactly one, let's say you have a feature and you ask 10 customers how important or not so important it is, right? And you come up with a very elaborate mathematical formula about deciding its criticality. Again, you have only interviewed those 10 customers. Every time you get the 11th customer, that function has changed, right? That calculation has changed. So it's impossible to be absolutely accurate. In fact, to some extent, trying to be absolutely correct is kind of a fool's errand. And you just have to develop that sense of, yeah, I know I'm not going to be 100% right, but I want to be generally right, and I want to be more right than especially my competitor. That is really what drives you.
With AI getting into the realm of decision making, do you see that helping or taking us into completely unknown areas and unpredictable consequences?
Can you elaborate, because it's such a generic question? I could answer it in 10 different ways. Yeah, just be a little bit more specific.
Unfortunately, it is not a specific question. It is just that we talked about the ambiguity associated with decision making, or even when things are ambiguous, one takes a call. And you said that you want to be more right than the competition, or what is probably best in that situation, etc.
Right.
Now, when we are trying to convert everything into algorithms and say that, yeah, my AI engine will be able to take decisions, the quality of data and what the engine has learned will matter a lot in terms of the decisions. Now, knowing that in most business situations, it is going to be at least some amount of ambiguity and some amount of variability also. Even if you make some assumption, that's probably going to change by the time you decide and take action. What do you see the role of AI? Is it going to make us all more efficient, or is it taking us into an area where we don't know what all is going to happen? Maybe it is
right. Okay, now I understand. So first of all, AI is a tool. Okay, AI is not. I do not consider AI as a way of delegating leadership decision. Okay, so think of it as a widget, or it's another arrow in your quiver, so to speak. The reason I say that is there are times that AI can give you better intuition than you figuring it out in your own head. And that is when you have done a very good job of identifying all the input parameters that potentially impact your outcomes, right? And included them in your AI modeling calculations or whatever, right? And the second aspect is when you have sufficient data points, observations, including known outcomes, so you can actually cross-validate. Your AI model always has to run against some test data to make sure it makes sense, right? So when these conditions are met, AI can be an excellent tool for you. But if you have too few data points, or you've ignored to include an important parameter, right, then AI tool could be very useless. I mean, it's garbage in, garbage out at that point. The biggest challenge often that happens, especially with the more recent AI techniques that I've seen, is the explainability. Oftentimes AI gives you a prediction, but if you look at how it computed that, it makes no intuitive connection. And then people struggle with, okay, this machine thing or this automaton is telling me something, but I don't know how it figured it out, or what was the logic it used, or what is the thinking behind the scenes. And sometimes there is no thinking, it's purely data-driven, model kind of thing. But the challenge comes is when that AI's computation or its recommendation is often counterintuitive to what you as a leader are looking at, right? And then you have to struggle through and ask yourself this question: did I take every input into consideration? Could this AI be doing the right job but with the wrong data or wrong set of parameters or incomplete set of parameters? That is something that you really have to. You cannot blindly just say AI will solve all problems, right?
Yeah. Thanks. So what is it that you have enjoyed the most in your career?
I would say the most would be working with some awesome people and learning from them and mentoring them. Learning from. And it's often a bi-directional relationship, because sometimes you mentor someone on something and you learn heck of a lot. And when that happens, it is magic, because it's almost like a symbiotic relationship. That is one. And my close second would be working on a variety of things. I started out in something, and then my opportunities and my career took twists and turns, and I've crossed at least 3 or 4 very distinct domains to get where I am. And I actually enjoy that process of learning something new and bringing something from my previous life or previous experiences into the new domain, because oftentimes it gives a very fresh perspective of looking at it. So those would be my two. But the first one has to be working with some really smart people, smart, motivated, and great people.
Yeah, very nice. Because ultimately, software is more of a team sport, and the team that you work with. Yeah. Right. So with that, I would like to ask one of my favorite questions, which is for people either considering entering IT or choosing IT as a career, or people who have been in IT for a while and are wondering, what should I do next? Since you said you've gone through multiple transitions in your career, what would you have to tell them?
The most important thing is, there are many tools out there, and the Myers-Briggs and personality tests, those kind of things. That what I'm referring to is first find out what makes you really happy. Okay, and I have this conversation is probably my most frequent conversations with folks, because often they are at the sort of fork in the road and they're trying to typically decide, do I continue being a technical expert, go down the architect career path, or do I become people leader? Okay, and oftentimes it is the external social pressures. What will my title say? How do I go to parties and explain them what my title is? I'm not growing, or I am growing, or whatever, right? How many people report to me? All of those things, I don't want to completely trivialize them, but at the end of the day, those are very external metrics. What really each of us is unique. We have our unique genius, and to figure out where you will be happiest because you do something better than you are world class at. So the question you ask yourself, what am I world class at? And try to go in that direction, because everything else will follow. If you're trying to do something that you're really good at and something you enjoy doing, that's the other. So look at that intersection, and hopefully what you enjoy doing, what you're good at, is also hopefully in demand. Otherwise, you might be very good at it, but you won't go anywhere with it. But if you kind of take the best point of intersection of these three and just pursue that, everything else will happen around you. Don't worry about short term. Personally, I have in past done leadership, then I went back to being an individual contributor because I really wanted to get into this Devops phenomena. So for a while, I actually just did Devops. I did not have anyone reporting to me, but pretty quickly they realized that this guy can do DevOps, but he's also good at leading people. So my career grew again there. So my advice would be, follow your genius, follow your heart. Don't worry too much about these external metrics at all.
Yeah, that's very nice and very clearly put, Rajiv. And I'm sure that whenever anybody is confused, using these basic things about being happy, finding your calling, I think is a good way to at least move on. And I'm sure that with technology growing and permeating everywhere, one will find one's own level.
Yeah. In that sense, and I know it's a little bit funny to mention this, but that movie 3 Idiots comes to mind, because that's exactly the core message of that movie. And I loved it for that reason.
Wonderful. I think that is a good positive high note to end this conversation with. And I'm sure we will have opportunities to get more perspectives from your experience in the future.
Would love to. Again, I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you and your audience here, and happy to be on it again, or hopefully you guys continue this series and make it successful, because what you're doing is very helpful to people, to your listeners, in terms of especially people who are trying to figure out what to do next in their careers. And I really view myself as more like I have learned by making mistakes, and if I can help somebody make fewer mistakes than I made, I think this would be well worth spending my time on doing these kind of things. So happy to do it.
Yeah, absolutely, Rajiv. That has been the motivation for us also to do it. And thanks once again.
Sure. Bye now. And be safe. Please take care of this whole your health and this coronavirus thing. Together we'll get over it. Bye now.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Malavika for promoting the Software People stories.
If you like this episode,
please subscribe on your favorite podcast client
and spread the word in your network.
If you'd like to share your story,
contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.